Welcome back, everybody, to the Deconversionists with your host, Alan Bondar, aka the Unraveler, and your co-host, Elliot Christopherson. Elliot, what's up, man? How you doing today, bud?
I'm good enough to be here.
Good enough.
How are you?
I'm good, except for this. That was a fall, Elliot. And you know what happens when you have a great fall? You need a resurrection.
Really? Well, you sure resurrected fast.
I did. It didn't even take me 6,000 years or 2,000 years or 7,000 years or 50,000 years
or even 3 days.
I did it instantly, man. That's how you do it.
That is how you do it. That's how you should do it. That's how you would do it if you were a perfect God.
That's true. In fact,
you just dispense with the theatrics and just get right to it.
In fact, if you were a god, you might not even need or necessitate a fall to begin with. And
right.
Then you resurrection. That would make more sense. Because you could just say, hey, y'all fucked up. I just forgive you.
You know what? We are using our human logic, and apparently we cannot do that. We have to just rack it up to the great mystery of God. God knows all things, and he apparently is doing it the perfect way, because everything God does is perfect. So who are we to question, right?
Yes. Who are we to question?
Even though he gave us brains that apparently are supposed to question things, because that is what we do as humans, that is not allowed.
Right.
So it's almost like it's another trap, just like the tree of the fruit of good and evil being planted right in the middle of the garden was a trap. So is our human reasoning that we are forced to use for everything except God.
Yes, except the God of logic that gave us that reasoning to begin with.
Right.
So he is the God of logic. He is the Logos. But we are not supposed to use Logos to get to God. We have to just take it on faith.
Right. Now, for anybody who might not be reading this right, this is called sarcasm. Because we are not actually Christians, and we need to clear that up right away, because apparently there was at least one person who thought last week we were giving rationalizations during our beginning conversation. Just because we talk about what we used to be and what our theology used to be does not mean we still hold to that.
Right.
So before we get started, I want to read a comment someone left on our last video. This is the problem you run into when you only watch the first 5 minutes of a stream like this that goes on for over an hour, is you make assumptions that are incorrect. So we had a comment that says, "What a bunch of rationalization, reverse engineered storytelling, and general bullshit. The world will never improve until we move on from this Bronze Era mythology. You guys come across as clowns. Hey, pretzel boys, let us all tell us all about how the Middle East is doing right now. And don't leave out that our orange slime president unilaterally started this for no reason after a prayer session. Rationalize the killing, just like you make up midrastic bullshit Bible explanations, just demented and gross. Hey, guess what? We agree with you."
Yeah, that was really weird.
Just because we tell you what we used to be does not mean that we are making rationalizations for it, because if he had watched further, he would have seen us trash the Genesis account. So anyway, just to put that to rest.
Yes.
Make sure you know what you're actually watching.
Yeah, and watch the whole thing. So last week was part 1 of the fall, where Elliot took us through the traditional futurist concept of the fall and Genesis there, and describing how it all happened and how ludicrous it actually is when you take it literally as it's written. And so, as promised, today we're going to take a look at what's known as the preterist view. And in all honesty, it's not really the preterist view, although I would argue that if you are a full preterist, you logically must also be what's called a covenant creationist. And I'll explain all these terms, so don't run away. I know you're like, oh, this episode sucks already. Don't run yet. I'll explain terms, and it really does make more sense of the text. I promise. At least it did, in my opinion, which is why I went there before I escaped Christianity altogether. But Elliot, just real quick question: can you hear my dogs constantly barking right now?
I can, in fact, yes. Unfortunately,
Okay.
but hey, we're doing this in the real world, so we're
Yeah.
not
All right.
professionals yet.
Hang on 1 second. I'm going to take care of this. Entertain
Okay,
everybody.
I will do that. So this week is actually this episode we're recording right now is actually our second attempt. We had some technical difficulties, and it didn't go well. So, like I said, we're not professionals. We're doing our best here. Um, so Ellen is going to give us his previous, when he was a Christian, his rationalizations that he had, how he read the book of Genesis, or at least the fall, and made sense to him. What I did last week was what I would call a plain reading of the text. I simply read the story for like how it's written, just a plain reading. And when you do that, the story doesn't make any sense if you analyze it in real time as you're reading it. So I'm really interested to see how Ellen is going to do what I imagine is not a plain reading of the text, using some very advanced rationalizations to make this make sense from his previous perspective. So
Very
go ahead.
advanced. Very advanced. So advanced that it requires faith. You'll see how faithful this is to the text. So thank you for your patience, everybody. My dogs were just like, I don't know what it was. Something set them off and they just wouldn't stop barking at the door. So I don't know how obnoxious that was in the video. I hope it wasn't too obnoxious.
Well, we know it wasn't the mailman because you, in fact, the mailman, are here.
Good point. I am, in fact, the mailman. All right. So preterism. So when it comes to the preterist view, preterism, as we've talked about in previous episodes, it just literally is a Latin word that means past fulfilled. That's the idea behind it. So it's, it teaches that the and I think it was even last week I talked about it a little bit, that it just shows that all the prophecies were fulfilled by 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the language is metaphorical, and it follows the pattern of the Old Testament prophecies. So stars falling from the sky is not literally stars falling from the sky. It's like much like our expressions or our idiom today. It's raining cats and dogs. Nobody runs outside to see if cats and dogs are actually falling from the sky. They understand it to be an idiom. It's like, oh, it's just raining heavy. Same basic idea when you see language like that. And that's the way the prophecies, if you go throughout the Old Testament, you can see that that's the way they're actually utilized, especially since you see passages like Isaiah 13. That's a prophecy about the fall of Babylon, and it's using all that kind of like cosmic language, but it's not literally cosmic language. It's just metaphorical or idiomatic about a nation being brought to ruin or destruction by God.
So were you not a biblical literalist when you were a Christian towards the end?
Not towards the end. No. At different stages in my life, I was like growing up or whatever. But no, it didn't take long for me to move away from that because it just really didn't make sense of the text. Like if you try to literalize everything, it just becomes asinine. Like where do you draw the line? When it talks about Christ being the door, like is he literally a door? Is that what he is?
Yeah. But I just want to. Yeah, I just want to clarify, like before you get into the preterist perspective here. I mean, would you agree that the majority of Christianity today follows, when it comes to Genesis, when it comes to the fall in the Garden of Eden, the majority of Christianity does follow a kind of a literalist interpretation where they do take those things to mean those actual things happened?
Yes and no. Like I think a lot of majority of Christians, as you say, will consider themselves literalists. Oh, I take the Bible literally, right? Until it gets to a spot, like I gave the example, where Christ is the door. Well, that's obviously a metaphor, right? So it becomes very, very justifiable to just say, oh, it's literal only unless it has to be a metaphor. You get to basically choose when that is the case. Christ the door, obviously he's not. So we have to. But what constitutes obviously? You know what I mean? Like when I say it's raining cats and dogs outside, obviously nobody thinks it's raining cats and dogs. But according to the literalist, stars falling from the sky, well, that obviously has to be literal. And it's like, really? Does it though? Like if you
So when
understand
we're
it is idiomatic.
when
Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, so when Genesis 3 says that in the midst of the garden there was a tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, like in your preterist interpretation, was that an actual tree with real fruit and two humans actually ate from it, or was that metaphorical?
So let me answer that, but without just saying yes or no to your question because it's a little more complex than that. Um, First of all, when it comes to reading a story, last week you had made the point that it's interesting that we read into Genesis all the stuff from the New Testament and we make a case for stuff that isn't actually in the text, like Satan being the one to possess the serpent or whatever. And if you're taking a literal reading of the text, and Adam and Eve is a literal story, and this is the literal layout of what God did with the first two humans, and this was his plan, and this is what he communicated to them, then I would 100% agree with you. That is kind of evil to do to your first two humans you've created, not actually give them all the information, not be clear, put this thing in the garden, screw them from the get go, create this intrigue. Like, you're absolutely right. All of that's a freaking nightmare. And that's a terrible way to read the text if in fact that's what happened. And it's also makes God out to be pretty damn evil. But if you are taking a story that's not even so much fiction, but is a metaphorical story that talks about something, but isn't given in literal terms, but it's written in a way that a child can understand. It's like, hey, here's our history, but we're not going to give you the details the way it actually happened. We're going to tell it in children's format so that you can actually grasp the story. Um, Sort of like it's almost like giving a fiction movie. You ever seen The Sixth Sense?
Yes.
So, so you're watching this movie and you kind of think you know what's going on until you get to the end, and all of a sudden it reveals something that makes you trigger all the way back to the beginning of the movie. And you're like, "Holy shit!" And it's almost like you rewatch the whole movie in your mind with this dead guy in perspective, and you're like, "What the hell?" And that's a really fun way to tell a story. It allows you to throw into the very beginning something you learned at the end that really you didn't know at the beginning, but then it suddenly brings whole full circle the whole story, and it makes complete sense. That's kind of what I'm saying takes place in the preterist understanding of the Bible. um, when you get to the end, it throws back into the beginning all the stuff that makes sense of the whole story. Um, Now, understand if you're watching, again, to that person who thinks we're still Christians, I am not arguing that the Bible's a true story and preterism makes Christianity true. I'm arguing that preterism makes the Bible story make the most sense, in my opinion. And whoever wrote it, though it's a whole fiction story to, completely from start to finish, I think it makes the most sense of the story, and it makes it a really fucking cool story, in my opinion. I just don't think it's real. I think it's just a story, and it's really awesome.
Now,
Um,
for that to be the case, that this story has to be taken, you know, with a grain of salt until you get to the end, and then it all makes sense, interpreting it backwards. For that to be true, I imagine you'd agree that the entire Bible would have to be of a supernatural origin, because otherwise, there wouldn't have been a unified message. Like the writer of Genesis, what he was writing at the time, like he know that this wasn't going to make sense if it was read literally, like with a plain reading, um, or did he have in his mind this divinely inspired narrative that was going to eventually make sense from this preterist perspective? I mean, does this
so,
require supernatural uh, effect?
so if you're still reading the Bible as though it's a true story, and you think that there are writers of it from Moses all the way through to the end, you think Moses was the writer of Genesis and whatever, then I can see the reason for your question, because we're still assuming that this story is true. I'm from at this stage in my life saying, oh, yeah, I missed this when I was a preterist because I thought this was a true story then, because your question has merit to it. It's an inherent merit that says, yeah, that's kind of ludicrous. But if you're just seeing this as a story, then it doesn't necessarily require you have writers from the very beginning of Genesis. People could have interpolated all this material into Genesis and written it even during the Babylonian time period where they were in captivity, utilizing a lot of the stories from from Babylon, and putting these stories into their history. So my take on it now is that it wasn't a whole bunch of writers starting from Genesis; is that they wrote this probably while they were in Babylonian captivity to make this whole story a really cool story. And then, New Testament writers come around and they're also, several generations after the events took place. And they're like, how can we make this story finish? Because this is a really cool story. And that's what they do. They finish it out and they make it really awesome. So I think the whole thing is fiction. I don't think any of it's literal.
Right. But like from the preterist perspective, this would have to have been a supernaturally inspired story from start to finish in order for the preterist perspective to be correct.
Correct. It would have to be a genuinely, it's an inspired story by God.
So the preterist would have to believe that the writer of Genesis was also a preterist, that believed he was writing a metaphorical story.
So the writer of Genesis okay. So again, I want to clarify because I know that a lot of preterists who might be watching, if they are, might be getting a little pissed off, being like, I don't believe that. So I just want to say, in my opinion, this interpretation of Genesis that I'm about to present here, in my opinion, is the logical outworking of the preterist view. I don't think you can logically be a preterist and not also what's called a covenant creationist. I just don't see how it's possible. But there are preterists who still don't believe the covenant creation aspect to the Bible, and I just don't see how you can. But for those preterists, sorry, I just think you're illogical. Get over it.
Okay, so before you deconverted, you were both a preterist and a covenant creationist?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
so I assume what you're just going to go ahead and give the covenant creationist perspective then.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay.
So in earlier episodes, and especially last week, I talked about how the end, especially like Revelation, is all couched in this idiomatic or metaphoric language, and it's not about the universe falling apart. It's about Israel's cosmos, Israel's world being destroyed, just like other nations like Babylon had been destroyed. And it uses cosmic language to describe Israel's cosmos. That's Israel's world. I mean, it really is. It's kind of like, I mean, if I might put it on a microcosmic cosmic level for us, like it'd be like, me and my wife and our kids. That's my world. Like that's the most important thing to me. So it's that kind of an idea. And so to an Israelite, Jerusalem would have been their world. That's where you go to the temple. That's where you worship God. That's where you're with your people. Like that was their world. So destroying Jerusalem, destroying the temple, that is a cataclysmic event. Like you just eliminated my ability to be in the presence of God. Like that's a big deal. So that's the way, as a preterist, I read the New Testament, especially all the cosmic prophetic language, because, as I said last week, it all fit within the time texts that the Bible mandated, like soon, near, at hand, this generation, some of you standing here won't taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his glory. The Son of Man's coming quickly. Those kinds of language. Like I got to a point where it was just like, man, what am I going to do with all this language? Am I just going to ignore it and pretend like it's not actually being told to that first century generation? And then you got all the New Testament epistles where the writers are comforting the Christians who are suffering, saying, hey, just wait a little while and it's going to end. What's the point of telling them that if that's not actually true? It would just be a lie. So I got to a point where I was like, okay, something's off here. Number one, there's an audience that's involved here, and this audience is literally being written to. They've got to believe that what these writers are saying is actually going to happen, or else this whole thing's a myth. Turns out it's a myth anyway. But anyway, at the time, that's what I thought. So that's part two. And then, of course, the time text saying when it was going to happen. So all of that had to happen in the first century. So that takes care of the ending. The whole universe is not what's being destroyed. It's the cosmos of Israel, the universe of Israel, so to speak. Jerusalem's destroyed. That's 70 AD. So the whole ending of the Bible, that's done. So what happens and I attribute to Tim Martin and Jeff Vaughn. They wrote a book called Beyond Creation Science. This was a book that I read along with John Walton's something of Genesis 1. Goodness, I can't think of what it's called. The Lost World of Genesis 1. And these books really helped influence me quite a bit because it made sense that if the ending of the Bible was not about the universe, but about the local nation, what made us think the beginning was about the universe? Maybe the beginning was also about the local nation. Maybe it was about God's covenant people just the same. So that takes you to the beginning. And you realize, there's, as you pointed out last week, there's so many problems with reading it as the creation literally of the universe that it makes you re-question. And you're like, wait a second, maybe we've just been misinterpreting the whole beginning altogether. And starting even in Genesis 1, you realize that this isn't the creation of the universe, it's the creation of a covenant. Language like the heavens and the earth, you find later in other texts where God is calling Israel out and forming them, and he calls them his heavens and earth. It's also interesting that the layout of the temple was called the heavens and the earth. You see in Josephus that when you enter into the temple, you got the heavens and the earth laid out. The heavens is where God's the kind of glory is. That's in the highest holy of holies place. And then you have the holy place, which is the 40-yard or the 40 measurements layout there where the priest could go, but not the high. The high priest could only go into the holy of holies. But then you have the holy place, and outside you have the land where all of Israel would rest and wait for the priests to come out. So all of Israel's layout, the temple, the tabernacle, the people themselves, there's this language of heavens and earth throughout the Old Testament language. And you start to realize, like, wait a second, maybe this isn't talking about the universe or some place called heaven and some place called earth, but it's actually idiomatic of a people, of a relationship, of a covenant that people would have with God. So that was the way that I started to understand. It'd be much like me saying, "Oh man, when I met Ray, I had to move heaven and earth together." You know, that's kind of like an idiom that we might use in the English language. And the same principle. We're not talking literal places. We're talking about an idiom that refers to a relationship. And so that started to make sense. So when you go back to the very, very beginning in Genesis, and you see that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If you read now, again, this requires you're reading back into the story, of course. But as you read back into the story, you're like, oh, the heavens and the earth. Maybe this is about God creating a people, calling them out into covenant with him, as opposed to making something material. God is forming his people in covenant relationship with him. So that actually made more sense of the Genesis 1 and 2 accounts, because when you read it literally, it scientifically doesn't make sense. You can't have a sun showing up on day 4 after you have vegetation planted. Like, that just doesn't add up. So there were so many problems with that. So this made more sense because it didn't matter what the order was, because it wasn't about the universe. It was about the forming of a people, and the different cosmic language described different portions of Israel's life. So fast forward to Genesis 3 now, where we get to the fall.
But right before you do that, I
Yeah.
just want to clarify that, but today, your perspective, do you believe that the Genesis account of the creation of the world was supposed to be about the world?
No, I still think the preterist story is the best interpretation of it. I still think the covenant creation aspect is, in my opinion, probably what the writers intended. Because it
Okay.
just makes the most sense of the story. I can't read it any other way anymore.
So you don't think it was an ultimate origin story to even now,
An origin story of Israel, not an origin
but not
story,
not of the world.
not of the no,
Okay.
just the world of Israel. Yeah.
Okay.
So I do think, and so when you read the language in Genesis 1 through 3, you have a serpent that's talking, and you have these naked people. It's very childish. It's got a very childlike story to it going on, and I think that was the point. So I think the way it was written was, the writers who wrote it were saying, "Hey, we're going to create our origin story, but let's write it so our children can understand it." And so that's the way it was written. It was written in a very childlike fashion so that a child could read it and be entertained by it. So it makes the most sense that way, in my opinion. So when you so it creates this idea where you can actually understand it as a child, because it's a lot of metaphor, it's a lot of idiom, it's fun to read. You don't have to take every detail literally, because that's never the point of a metaphoric story. It's not intended to be taken literally, but it gives you a picture, a holistic idea of what took place. Um, so it also allows the adults to understand what actually took place, because the adults can now go to the New Testament and you see where the Apostle Paul calls Christ the second Adam. He does that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, for example. So if Christ is the second Adam, the whole idea is that Adam foreshadowed Christ and Eve foreshadowed the church, because Christ marries the church. And so you see this pattern where the whole idea of the Genesis account was a foreshadowing of what was to come. So Adam had to die, and then Christ was going to be the one to rise. He was going to fulfill all the things Adam failed in. He's the second and final Adam. So that also means that if Christ, as is explained in the New Testament, if he is the high priest of the people of God, then that means Adam also was the high priest that failed what Christ succeeds in. So if Adam is functioning as a high priest, that means that there had to be sin in the garden to begin with. It wasn't like Adam was functioning as a high priest for nobody. So what we start to read into the story is that there were already nations. The universe already existed. Genesis 1 isn't a creation account of the universe. The universe was already here. And so whatever we decide scientifically to do with the universe has no bearing on the biblical text. The Bible is nothing more, in the preterist viewpoint, and covenant creation tied into that, is nothing more than a story of Israel's relationship with God. Nothing to do with the universe at all. So that made sense to me, because for the first time ever as a Christian, I was like, oh, crap, I don't have to battle science anymore. This creationism stuff is stupid. Like, I don't have to worry about that. That's why Tim and Jeff's book were called Beyond Creation Science. So the Genesis account is about covenant relationship, and Adam is called out from among the nations to be a high priest for the nations. He is there to be able to make atonement so that the people in the universe can find a way to have relationship with God. And so he, in a sense, what's happening in the Genesis 1 through 3 accounts is that Adam is placed in a garden. And this garden is the temple. It's the tabernacle where Adam gets to go in and meet with God. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they're in the center of the garden. They're where God is. That's the place where Adam is supposed to go and actually relate with God, but he's not supposed to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was always still a tricky thing to me. In my opinion, that was like, I kind of, because you get to do a lot of playing around with the text when you're seeing it metaphorically. I mean, let's face it, if it's not taken literally, you get to basically make up whatever you want. So that's kind of what you do with the Genesis account. So I saw the tree of the knowledge of good and evil kind of a metaphor for sex, especially illegitimate sex. And so what I see happening is the serpent, whoever that is, later I come to read into the story as well that the serpent is the king of Tyre from Isaiah, where the futurists tend to place the fall of Satan, Lucifer, or the fall of Satan. That's the king of Tyre, where instead of it being the fall of Satan, it's the fall of Lucifer, who was a metaphoric reference to the king of Tyre. And so he probably is the one who actually ends up having illegitimate sex with Eve, and they produce twins, but not because of him. The twin comes from Adam. So Cain, and this is just my reading, of course. Now I'm getting into some of the fun stuff that I read into it. So Cain comes from the king of Tyre and Eve, and then Abel comes from Adam and Eve. And so you have this interesting thing going on where you have twins in the womb of Eve, but they're from two different fathers. And I researched this when I was a Christian to see if this was even possible, and it turns out it is. It's actually happened more than once, that you can actually have twins from two different fathers. So that was kind of my take on this story of what's going on in the garden here. And so what you have is this story of sex, but it's told in children's terms, the way children can understand. So you don't have to go into the details of sexuality with the children. So that was kind of the way I read the story. And so So that's kind of what's going on in my opinion in the garden story is that Adam is a high priest. He's there to represent. He fucks it up. He's not doing the right thing because he does something illegitimate with Eve, along with the king of Tyre. There's this whole thing going on, and that's what causes the fall of Israel. Because once again, when you read the story, there is a definite article that's coming before the word sin. So it's not just sin in general; it's the sin that brought the fall. It's the sin that caused everybody to be separated from God. It's this particular sin that takes place in the garden that causes the posterity of Adam to now fall into sin and need redemption as well. And so that ends up coming through in Christ, the high priest, who fulfills the whole thing. So the whole point of the story is that God intentionally needs to bring sin into the world because the whole goal of the story is Christ. So without bringing the fall, without bringing sin into the world, and no matter what you take, what view you take of how Adam fell, my sexual story part really doesn't matter. That's a very inconsequential part of it. I'm just sharing it because it was a fun part of it. But whatever you view the fall to be, eventually the whole point of the story is that Christ was supposed to come and be the glory of God. He was supposed to be the one that shows what unconditional love looks like. And without the fall, you can't have unconditional love. So Christ comes and he actually does something that's impossible, something that you can't do unless you have sin in the world. So he comes and he redeems Israel, raises Israel from the dead. And so now the nations can actually come in and be saved through Israel, through spiritual Israel, because that's who Christ redeems. So one of the issues in the garden that made me also see that the creation, the covenant creation / preterist view is the only one that makes sense is God tells Adam and Eve, or particularly Adam, in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Right. So in comes the serpent and he says to Eve, did God say you will surely die? Surely you won't die, right? You'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And then Eve eats of the fruit. And does she die? Does Adam die? Well, that depends on how you define death. They didn't fall on their, fall to the ground dead, obviously, because Adam lived like 900 more years. So they didn't die. They didn't die physically. So, either death isn't physical in God's curse, or God lied and the serpent told the truth. So if you're a Christian, you're saying, well, God can't lie. So you must eliminate physical death then, because that isn't what happened. Then you have to bring in a whole new aspect and say, oh, it wasn't physical death. It was spiritual death, or if you will, covenant death. That's what happened in the garden. And that's why, when you get to the New Testament, Adam says that, Paul says that, first the natural, then the spiritual. In Adam all die, but in Christ all are made alive. So it was never about physical death. Physical death was inevitable. That was already happening even before God called Adam and his people into covenant relationship, because the universe already existed and people have been existing forever and ever. So that was just part of the story. That was no big deal. It was the covenant death that became a problem. And that's what the whole story is from beginning to end. So Genesis really becomes a prophetic element. It's prophetic of what's supposed to happen in the new covenant when Christ comes and fulfills all the things that Adam failed to do, like be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's what Christ does spiritually, because Adam fails to do it in the correct method. He produces them in sin instead. And so anyway, you got all that going on. So I'll pause for a second if you have any questions. That was a lot of information, but that's kind of the overview, very, very quick overview of how I understood the text.
Okay. I'm not sure where I want to go with this because I am having trouble comprehending that you still think this is the right interpretation of it, even after what we know about Genesis let's just put aside a plain reading of it, because when I read it plainly, I get absolutely none of that whatsoever. Like if I am existing, 2000, 3000 years ago, and I have Genesis, let's assume it's already been written. And I mean, take out all the cultural context, which obviously I don't have access to, not neither of us do. We can't go back as a Hebrew and read it as a Hebrew would, but I would like to try to imagine being a Hebrew and reading it like this, or not reading it like that, but like just reading it. Um, I see an origin story, and and that's it. Um, and I think the tell of that is the stories that Genesis was based on. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, they would have had access to, and the Epic of Gilgamesh contains all of these same elements. The Epic of Gilgamesh was an origin story of the world, and they were copying all those different elements, like the garden. I believe there might have been a talking snake in it. I'm not totally sure, but there was a tree, there was a fall, there was eventually a flood. It appears to me that the ancient Hebrews were simply copying a different culture's origin story for the beginning of the world. In order to add the interpretation that you're using, I literally would have had to have had foreknowledge back then, something supernatural to make it into some kind of prophecy, especially about the church. Um, I think you're getting to still maintain that interpretation as the correct one, whether it's true or not. As an atheist, I don't see how you can still say that the covenant creationist preterist perspective is the right way to read that. I get none of that.
So the reason I think that now is because I don't think the Bible is a true story. I don't think it's an origin story of the universe. I think it's a story that was written much like The Sixth Sense. So I think that's the whole point of it from beginning to end is the writers had every intention of this being written in prose, written in Hebrew idiom, so that we would not take it as God's ordained story from beginning to end to be taken literally. I
But they
don't.
all would have had to have been on the same page throughout Israel's history. I mean, they all would have had to have been in on that. I mean, you're essentially saying this was a conspiracy to write the story like this from beginning to end. But I don't think that's humanly possible.
Well, I mean, because I don't think Moses actually wrote Genesis, for example. I don't think it was written
No,
until
of course not.
yeah. So I think they're retrospecting their whole entire history. Like I don't even think Moses existed. I mean, there's no reason to even believe he did.
Well, I don't
Um,
think they really had much of a history at that point. That's around 500 BC, and they're in Babylon. They've been conquered, they've been taken to Babylon. Now
right,
they're, for the first time, they're going to encode their oral traditions, and they're going to
right.
copy from other cultures around them. Like for that, just starting at 500 BC, going all the way up to Christ, and that would require all of those Hebrew writers to be in on the conspiracy, to create the story with that perspective in mind. Instead of that, so Occam's razor would say that the simplest explanation is that this was just another origin story of the creation of the world, like every other culture has.
So my take on it though would be that I think in order for them to make themselves unique and stand out from the other nations, though they borrowed origin stories, theirs was unique in that they believed they had the only true God. We have the only right God, and He's more powerful than all these other gods. And so their origin story is unique in that you all were there, but you don't have this special relationship with God that we have. Ours is a
Right.
covenant relationship that you don't have. So it makes their story unique and stand out from the other stories.
Not it. Well, I mean, I imagine every culture thinks the same thing, that they have a unique origin story. I mean,
Sure,
they're all unique in their own way.
sure.
But for them to be writing it with this this 4D meaning. I mean, it's pretty advanced. What your perspective here is very advanced. And when I read Genesis, I don't think in 100 years of me reading it and trying to psychoanalyze it, I could come to your method of interpreting it.
You couldn't just reading Genesis. No, you'd have to actually have the entire Bible in perspective. You
Right,
couldn't.
but they did, but they didn't. They didn't though. Like
That makes sense. Correct.
they would have had to have been in on this from the beginning to the end. And I don't. That is a conspiracy. I mean, that's what a conspiracy is a group of people that have the same idea, and they maintain it. Um, and they don't tell you exactly what they mean. Um, they kind of hide it. And for your interpretation to be correct, like so many Hebrew writers for such a long period of time would have had to be clued in on that from the very beginning. It's so much simpler of an explanation to say this was their original origin story of where they think the earth came from. I mean,
Yeah.
every culture has to have one.
Yeah. No, you make sense. It hadn't actually occurred to me that you're right. They would have all had to been involved in this conspiracy, and actually, had it all been written by the same writers of the Gospels, I think I could make a case that well, they were because they were all writing the same story, but they weren't. This is the Old Testament was not actually ever intended to be completed by the New Testament. That just ends up happening later.
And even the New Testament writers didn't clue us in to what was actually happening
Right. We have to
in the garden. I mean, and I think that if they had been retrospectively trying to reinterpret that, or even not reinterpret it, just to continue that covenant creation narrative, I think at some point they would have like tried to have gone back and clued us in. I mean, even when use the Sixth Sense as a analogy, even in the Sixth Sense, in the end, it clues us in. Hey, he was dead the whole time.
Yes.
But the writers of the Gospels never said, well, Adam was Israel the whole time.
Now I can actually think there's a case to be made that if you're one of the gospel writers and you're being influenced by the deceit of the government and the powers that be, and the whole goal is to maintain power, then I can see how you're not going to make it clear, but make it look like this is all mysterious and stuff. But to your point about the people in Babylonian captivity tying it in with these New Testament writers, that doesn't actually compute anymore. You make a good point there. I do see the problem.
And I think another problem is when Paul like explicitly tells us that as sin entered into the world through one man, Adam, then the salvation comes through one man, which is Christ. He calls Adam a man, and and if Adam was the first man, then the original sin in the fall would make sense. And especially, it would make far more sense if it wasn't metaphorical and if it was an actual man who did sin, than it being a metaphorical Israel breaking its covenant with God. I would like to think that Paul would have told us that Adam was Israel and Israel broke the covenant.
Well, you
But
have some problem. You do have some like the preterist perspective makes, again, in my opinion, that if you're going to take the Bible as a whole and disregard the intentions behind the writers and you just read it as a story, I still would argue the preterist interpretation makes the most sense. I don't know that it makes sense in light of what the writers intended now. So I'm like, yeah, you're right. That doesn't add up.
Preterism makes sense for the ending. It makes sense for Revelation. It makes sense
Well,
for
the
Fall
beginning
Jerusalem.
too, from this perspective, like you were just bringing up Adam and being the first man, but Paul compares that and he calls Christ the last man. And we know that Jesus wasn't the last man on earth. So these terms, first and last, they're not speaking in terms of like literally first and last person on earth. We're talking about
Do you have do you have a reference for where he calls Adam the last man?
Yeah, it's in 1 Corinthians 15.
1 Corinthians 15. Okay.
Let me jump to that here because I don't think we need.
Yeah, you'll probably be able to pull it up quicker.
We don't need Genesis open right now. Corinthians 15. Let me just do a quick search.
I mean, I agree that the story doesn't
There you go.
any sense at all.
Here you go. Let Get rid of this ad. All right, so there we go. The last Adam. So the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Verse 45 there. First a spiritual, and then first a natural, and then a spiritual. So yeah, the first Adam and the last Adam. Christ is the last Adam. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't bring that. Oh, I apologize. Let me add it to stage. I didn't ever add it to stage. Here you go. Verse 45. Can you see it?
Okay, I'll try to read off the screen. Okay,
Thus it
verse
is written.
45. Thus it is written, the first man Adam became a living being. Okay, he quotes it. So yeah, that's correct. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. The last Adam, life-giving spirit. So he doesn't call him a man, he calls him a spirit. The last Adam. That is fucking bizarre, man. I have
if you jump to verse
never seen that
47, you
before.
have another problem. Verse 47 says the first man was from the earth, man of dust. The second man is from heaven. Jesus obviously wasn't the second man to ever exist. This is talking
Okay,
about.
well that makes perfect sense if Genesis was literal. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. Yeah.
Right, but who's
The second man was from heaven.
Yeah. He's not the second
man.
universal man that ever exists. This is not talking about humanity in general. It's talking about covenant men, heads of the covenant people. That was the only way that made any sense of the text.
Okay.
So the point.
I'm gonna go.
The point is not that, and I think you're making a good point. Like the original writers of the Old Testament probably never had this in mind. You're right. They probably, for all intents and purposes, had Genesis written as an origin story. The New Testament writers come along and they're like, hey, we have a golden opportunity here. We can retrospect into the text a whole different reading that makes far more sense than what they originally intended.
Well, it's unfortunate though that Paul doesn't go very deep into that though. He makes a very strange connection there that he just doesn't explain. I don't think that. I mean, from Paul, I don't think Paul's explanation is very good at all. It's not an explanation at all. In fact, of course, it's one man's opinion. It's Paul.
Yeah.
Paul clearly doesn't speak for like the Hebrews at large. He's probably just making this up as his own fan fiction.
For sure. Well, look, you and I are both coming from the same perspective. The whole Bible is mythology. I don't think any of this is true. The question comes down to, what were the intentions of either party here? Were the New Testament writers in cahoots? Did Paul just write this and then the gospel writer come in later and be like, hey, we can find ways to make this fit? And there's just so much mystery going on in this whole thing.
So the scholarly consensus of New Testament scholars is that the Gospels were written after Paul, and they were simply using Paul's. I don't know if they're using much of Paul's writings actually, because Paul never talks about Jesus' life, never quotes Jesus, doesn't talk about his earthly ministry whatsoever. It's like Paul is operating on some sort of a spiritual realm, not thinking in the physical on earth when he talks about Jesus whatsoever. In fact, Dr. Richard Carrier makes a really good case that Paul did not think that Jesus was a real physical man, that all the events of the Gospels took place in the second heaven above earth, in a spiritual realm. We have the writers of the Gospels like co-opting stories about Jesus and writing their own like physical account of what they think might have happened.
Elliot, pause for just a second. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, I feel like I'm watching a Chinese movie. Your lips are way off from your audio.
Okay, well, as we learned in our failed attempt an hour ago, it's still good on the viewer's part.
I don't know that. Now I'm not sure. Can you go out and come back in, because you're way behind what you're saying? Elliot will be right back. So now you have me to entertain you for just a second. Um, so anyway, to Elliot's point, and here he comes back. So I don't need to make Elliot's point because here he is. You back?
Yep.
Yeah, it's
Let
much
me
better.
let me know if I freeze up again.
Nope, you're good right now. Perfect. I heard everything you said though. It was just your lip
Okay.
roll. You can keep going.
Okay. I'm going to assume that everybody caught it too. I
I
was
mean,
I was
yeah.
just saying that there's a massive disconnect between what Paul says about Jesus and what the Gospels say about Jesus, and the scholarly consensus of the New Testament. People that do it for a living, they study the New Testament for a living. Their consensus is that the Gospels were written after Paul. Like Paul had his ministry in the 50s, and he was executed in the 60s, and the first gospel didn't show up until after the year 70, either in or after the year 70. So the writers of the gospels are writing about a physical Jesus in a physical place, doing a physical earthly ministry, and actually saying things and engaging with people, while Paul is talking about a spiritual Jesus. Never quotes him, never talks about his time on earth. There's this huge disconnect between the two. So now Christians have a problem because they have to marry those two and combine them and make them make sense together. So they just say, hey, Paul just wasn't around for his earthly ministry, so he never referenced it.
He actually does at least twice. I mean, he talks about how he broke bread and did the Lord's Supper. So he does
Well,
reference.
it could be metaphorical. It could well, like I mentioned before, Dr. Richard Carrier thinks that those events took place in a spiritual sense or in the second heaven, not necessarily on earth. Now, I'm not sure if I agree with that, but he makes a really good case for that, because Jesus said is purported to say a lot of things in the Gospels. He preaches sermons. He's got the Sermon on the Mount, and he has the Sermon on the Plain in Matthew and Luke. That's a lot of statements. That's a lot of theology right there, a lot of teaching. And Paul completely ignores all of it as if he was totally unaware that it took place. That is a serious problem for Christians. That's a
Well,
serious problem for
Paul
Bible
wasn't.
scholars.
Paul wasn't. I mean, theoretically, Paul wasn't around for Christ's earthly ministry, so
But
he was.
somebody had ostensibly, someone had a record of those sayings, which would be why they were able to write the Gospels later on. So did somebody else maintain those sermons and Paul never got his hands on them? I mean, he was around quite a bit. He traveled. I mean, his travels are legendary in the book of Acts. He most definitely would have encountered somebody who had a record, whether it was oral or written record of Jesus' teachings. Yet he completely ignored them, all of it. That's a problem. I know we're a little far afield from our subject.
Well, no, not really, because the one thing that you're drawing attention to, and it's a very important point, whether you meant to make this or not, and it's that um, the traditional interpretation of the Genesis account makes so little sense, and it's so convoluted and messed up that you need an interpretation that makes some sort of sense of it. In come preterism to try to save the day, and it makes some sense of it until you start to highlight some of the things you did, and then you're like, oh, yeah, even the preterist story doesn't really make much sense of it. The covenant creation view is really being read into it, and coming from a New Testament writer who doesn't even draw attention to Jesus very much, other than the message he supposedly taught and that he saw him in a vision. But he's pretty much making up his own gospel the whole way. Um, and
Well,
then
I would say I would say that the literal interpretation of Genesis makes perfect sense in 500 BC. It might not, in Jesus' time, it might not today. But if we go all the way back to that period, like the further back you go in history, the less and less information that humans have about the natural world or about
yeah,
anything really.
but in what world? I mean, I can't imagine in any scenario, no matter how scientific you're inept about, that you can think the sun can come into play 4 days after you have
Well,
vegetation.
they're making it up. So if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, very little of that makes sense from a literal perspective either. But that's clearly how they were taking it. Like they were imagining a time and place far far removed in the past even from them. Anything was possible, anything could have happened. I mean, we have origin stories from every culture that make absolutely no sense, but they all take them literally. For example, the a lot of Native American tribes think that the earth was created on the back of a turtle. um I mean, there's some crazy shit out there, and these people had no clue what they were talking about, but they believed it in a literal sense, and that creates problems for them today, and would spark a reinterpretation if they were forced to explain it today. But back then, they didn't have to account for any of those factors. The writers of Genesis and the writers of the Epic of Gilgamesh at the time didn't have to account for anything. They could tell the most illogical stories possible, like everyone else did during that time, and they were not accountable.
Yeah, well, that's true. I suppose that makes sense. And I suppose if they're the intelligent ones, then the rest of the people are like, well, I don't know anything better, so
Yeah,
it's just that's our origin story. I guess it's
yeah. I
true.
mean, the more origin stories you read, and from the ancient world specifically, the more it starts to make sense from that time and place.
Right.
It being literal.
But it is interesting that the more advanced we have become in our understanding of the universe scientifically, how many new interpretations of the Bible, especially Genesis, have come about to align with the evidence that we have discovered. If this in fact was God's word and all you needed was God's word to know the truth, because that's what creationists do. We just know this is true. It's the Bible. The Bible tells us it's true. And so we're just going to hold to it. And there's no evidence whatsoever to sustain the view that creation is a thing, that there's a designer. We just know it is because the Bible tells us so. Um, and yet now we have to adjust our view of the Bible because science has opened our eyes to things that make no sense of Genesis
Hmm.
1. And so we just keep reinterpreting and reinterpreting. And it's like, at what point are we going to be like, maybe we shouldn't just rely on this book and say this is the truth when we
Yeah,
constantly keep changing our mind on what it means?
yeah. Look, I would point out that I don't know if it was the Greeks or the Romans. I can't remember which. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference because they were almost contemporaries. But they both had a pantheon of gods, and they believed them literally. Um, I mean, it was a capital offense to question their existence. They literally believed that the sun was dragged across the sky by Apollo in his chariot. Now, obviously today those beliefs are long gone because they couldn't support them. But if an advanced for its time culture like the Greeks, famed for their intellect, could literally believe that Apollo was dragging the sun across the sky, then I don't see why the Hebrews couldn't have literally believed that the sun was created on day four.
Well, I guess if everything was done by the gods at all times, then I suppose it doesn't matter because the gods were the reason we were living anyway. So um, I guess the sun didn't really have much say in what happens. I guess in their minds. I mean, it's a good
Yeah,
point. I mean, they
and
clearly understand the essential element of the sun is. Like they didn't really recognize what it does for our universe. So um,
well, the Genesis says that God created two lights. Now I'm forced to just take it literally because I honestly, man, I don't know what else to do with it. But it says that God created two lights, one to rule the day and one to rule the night. I don't see how that could be metaphorical. It's obviously talking about the sun and the moon. Um, but I mean, they clearly screwed up when they said the moon is a light, which it definitely isn't, but it's to rule the night. Now, I mean, there's plenty of times I look up at high noon and I can see the moon right there visibly. I mean, so I mean, it was, if you read it from their limited perspective, when they see a full moon, like, well, this is a light in the sky and it's out at night giving us light. They weren't thinking it, they weren't thinking carefully, but that's what they did back then.
yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of interpretations, obviously, of the text. Even Augustine, if I'm not mistaken, took a view of recapitulation on Genesis Which, in that case, you could, you could read into it, because this is what starts to happen is once you have science demonstrating the fallacy of Genesis 1 in a scientific method, then you're like, well, God obviously didn't inspire this because that makes no sense. And so we're like, oh, well, we can't have God be embarrassed, so we got to make up stuff. And so you have recapitulation where, now you see the light that governs the day and that governs the night. These are covenant heads, and then the people are the stars. And so it's a recapitulation of the creation of Adam and Eve. And I mean, you can just literally start to make up anything you want
Yeah,
to
I
make
mean, it sounds like witchcraft.
yeah,
Really, I mean, we are divining tea leaves to try to make these things make sense. When I mean, the Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is the best, and it's that the Hebrews were borrowing other origin stories and trying to come up with their own, and they look real fucking similar.
yeah. Well, and so the key point today, and I think was the climax of this conversation, and I think you nailed it, is even if this was written later in time in the Babylonian captivity, which would be my take even as a Christian, I think. Um, but but regardless, that demonstrates that it wasn't like there was this big conspiracy to make all this align with something that was going to come yet another 600 years later when the New Testament was written, to somehow make this whole thing a preterist story. So you're right. I mean, it's like, wow, that doesn't make any sense. That this was their origin story. They weren't intending it to be about Jesus coming and saving the day, and that was never the intent of the story. So that makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
I think every culture is forced to have its own origin story, or else they can't make sense of the world or where it came from. Because what are the big questions in life that religious leaders like to throw around? Oh, who are we? Why are we here? Where do we come from?
Right,
And so you
right.
look around the world like, well, how did this get here? And you're forced, if you're going to be a religion or if you're going to be a cohesive culture, you're forced to come up with a story to explain it. And like that's how I take Genesis 1. It's like in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Like I can't make that make sense metaphorically for me. Um
No, it makes sense. And now as an atheist, but to those of you who are still full preterists that might be watching this, and you're like, yeah, but that makes the most sense of the story, and that's why I continue to believe. I'm a faith, I trust God's word from beginning to end. He put this whole thing together. It's like, okay, sure, I can understand why you would think that, because it really, if you do believe that this thing was intended for this, it's kind of a beautiful story, and it almost looks like it's God ordained and God put together, and and your origin story is just that that this God created this universe. It just doesn't tell us how, but that's inconsequential. It doesn't matter. It's just he introduces himself for the first time in Genesis 1, and that's the way you read it. It's the way I read it, and it's like, okay, that's all good and fine and well, but the question, the thing I want you to think about, if you're a full preterist that's still saying this is the most sense I've ever made of the Bible, and it just resonates, and it did to me, and it does to you probably. The thing you need to think about is, at the end of the day, the one problem it's the hinge pin problem with full preterism is the whole thing, worse than futurism, has to be taken on faith, because there is no even ending to this universe where at some point the futurist at least can say, yeah, but just wait, because one day empirically all of this is going to happen, and when Jesus finally shows up, you're going to see, okay, well, when that happens, we're going to see. And at least it'll be demonstrated, right? So at least the futurist has that. It's silly to anticipate it, but it is what it is. Like, we will prove it empirically one day. Okay. The preterist can't improve anything empirically. You can't prove it. Nothing. Nothing is empirical in preterism. The whole thing is taken on faith. Your interpretation of the Old Testament, read into it from the Old because you take the new on faith. The whole thing, the benefits of the new covenant, the kingdom that's supposedly here that we live in, all the fruits of the Spirit, everything you supposedly have in Jesus, the salvation, it's all faith. There's nothing tangible about the new covenant promises being fulfilled. Nothing. And there's never a time where Jesus is going to come and fulfill it empirically for you, where you can prove it. It's just never going to happen. The whole entire thing is based on faith, because according to the preterist, there's no end to this universe. We just come and go forever and ever, and Jesus just saves more people, and you just go to heaven. There's nothing to hold on to. Like, wake up. You're living by faith, and there's no good reason to hold anything by faith. Why? Because anything can be taken on faith. How can you know that what you are taking on faith is correct when anybody can make anything up and say it's faith? How do you know? You have no way of knowing. And if it's just based on faith, what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? What if some other God that is out there ready to punish anybody who believes in Jesus is the one that's going to be, is the right God? Then you're really screwed because you're worshiping the wrong God. You can't possibly know anything based on faith. There's just no way to know. It is untestable. There's no method of faith by which you can empirically know anything. And look, I know Christians love to say this. Well, not everything that's true can be tested. Okay, maybe that's a true statement, but how do you know? How can you possibly know if something exists if you have no way to measure it? If you can't measure this thing, how do you know? You're just freaking guessing. There's got to be a way that you can measure it in order for you to be sure. And if there isn't a way to measure it, then you just can't possibly know. That's just the bottom line. You may want it to be true, but you can't know that it is because you have no way to measure it. Like, this is a real problem with faith, man. Now, I'm sorry, I just preached for like 30 minutes, but
That was an excellent monologue. I had somebody tell me, this relates a little bit. I had somebody tell me this week that religion cannot be proven false or proven true because it is a belief system. Now, belief systems are impervious to proof one way or the other. So you as an atheist can't prove it false. And you can't say it's false, and you as a religious person can't do the same. Now, obviously that implies that you have to take it on faith. But what that person was trying to do was they were trying to give themselves an excuse to keep believing something because I couldn't prove it false. Now, my retort to that was, and I believe this because I can't think of a counterexample. But no matter what the religion is, including would say including preterism, at some point that belief system has to venture out into the real world and make real world claims about reality, which can in fact be tested. Once you do that, once you have made a statement about the world, it is subject to proof. It's subject to evidence. It's subject to arguments, and it's subject to falsifiability. There, it has to be a way in which you can prove it to be false. A way to prove it to be false. Not that you can prove it to be false, but there is a method. So, for example, like if you use a literal interpretation of the Bible, you're going to say that the Genesis account is accurate. It's an accurate description of the world. Now, once you do that, now we can test it, and that is where evolution and creation butt heads dramatically, and it's the subject of countless debates. But it is making statements that can be tested, so you do not need to use faith. Now, I don't know when or where the preterist position ventures out into the real world and makes claims, but my guess, my estimation is that at some point it has to, because it is talking about real people and real world effects. So maybe you, as a preterist, don't take Genesis to be interpreted literally, but you, at the same time, are going to venture out and make claims about miracles, probably maybe even modern day miracles. You're going to make claims about prophecy. You're going to make claims about answered prayer, all of the other things that come with a belief system. Once you do that, those are subject to testing. Those are subject to evidence, arguments, and methods to falsify them. So there is no, well, it might seem like there's a get out of jail free card for a lot of religious claims and a lot of religious systems where, hey, you can't prove I'm wrong. um, it's a spiritual claim that does eventually break down and fail once you start making claims about things in the real world. So you don't have to take anything by faith. It's just that religious people want you to have to take it solely on faith, but they're always going to be incorrect at some point.
Yep, that's a great monologue as well, man.
Faith is an excuse.
Faith is an excuse.
But
There,
as soon as you say God answers prayer, or I witnessed a miracle, or this prophecy came true, it can be tested.
yeah, and for those of you who are listening now and you're saying, "Oh, it takes faith not to believe something. It takes just as much faith not to believe in God." God, I hate when people say that. Because look, it doesn't take faith not to believe something. That's an absurd statement. If you don't believe something, that's not faith.
Faith,
It's in fact just
faith
the
is
absence of faith.
faith is an action, and me as an atheist, I'm refusing to take action. I'm
Right.
refusing to take action on your claims. I'm not making claims of my own. I'm not saying I believe there is no God and that's my faith claim. I'm just saying you claim there's a God and your religion is true or your faith is true, and I'm just saying I'm not taking action on that. I don't accept that. I don't believe that. I don't require any action, and faith is an action.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, and there is a colloquial way in which we speak sometimes about things that we don't believe exists, but we're not making a claim that we can prove it doesn't. Like I might say, no, I don't believe the Easter Bunny exists, or I might just simply say the Easter Bunny doesn't exist. That's a colloquial saying. I have no reason to think it does. Can I prove the Easter Bunny doesn't exist? Well, how the hell can you prove something doesn't exist? I don't know how you can prove that. There's no way to prove that, but it's not a faith claim that it
Well,
doesn't.
yeah, and even that, even the Easter Bunny is subject to some kind of testing because what does the Easter Bunny do? Well, it brings the eggs. I mean, if you're actually going to believe there's an Easter Bunny, you have to go further than that. It's not just hey, he's out there somewhere creeping around. Like, no, he does something on Easter. Like that's the whole point of the Easter Bunny is he brings the eggs. So that's something we can test.
Right. But even so, like even if you test it empirically, the same theistic argument is, oh yeah, but you just can't see him. You have to take it on faith. You can't see him deliver the eggs. He just magically does it, or he does it spiritually, or whatever. Make up
Right,
whatever.
but I mean, if the eggs do show up, that's a real world claim. That's a real world action. Like it's like I mean, you can apply the same thing to Santa Claus. Well, what is okay? So I can't prove Santa doesn't exist because I can't search every square inch of the North Pole. You
Right,
got me. But you claim Santa Claus actually does something in the real world. He visits every house and brings presents. And we know how he does it. He rides a reindeer. He lands on the roof. He comes down the chimney. Like that's something that I can now test. So the same way with belief in God, you say, well, God answers prayers. That's something I can test. I can't prove to you God doesn't exist, but I can prove that every single claim you make about how God interacts in the world, like I can prove every one of those false, or at least have a method to test them to prove them false.
right,
So
right.
at some point, every belief system has to venture out into reality, or else that belief system is worthless. What does it do for me? What could
Unless
it
you're
possibly do?
unless you're talking to a preterist, because he doesn't actually do anything in the world. It's all faith driven. Everything he does is spiritual. All of our
Did
blessings
you
are spiritual. We have nothing.
did you believe in miracles and answers to prayer when you were a
Not
preterist?
currently. Those were all things that only took place in the Bible time. But since 70 AD, none of that actually happens. We believe
But
in prayer.
you
Prayer
did
only,
believe in prophecy though.
but not something that took place anything past 70. So
But
again,
it still gave you something
it was an
that you could
escape.
study.
It's an escape because, like, no matter what you throw at me, I can say, well, yeah, of course that happened. It happened in the Bible. Just go look. But
Well,
today, that
that's where we switch disciplines and we go and look at history and we can show that prophecies did not take place.
well, sure. I mean, I don't know how you'd prove that that happened to begin with. I mean, when you're talking 2,000 years in the past, how the hell do
Well,
you prove?
some every once in a while, well, you can though, and I've got a chapter in my book on several failed prophecies. Every once in a while in the Bible, they screwed up and they made a prophecy that had not actually come true yet because they weren't working backwards, and whenever they did that, it did fail.
But I'm saying, how do you prove a prophecy that did come true?
You can't prove that it did come true, but I can certainly prove that it didn't.
Well, sure, but But to prove something 2,000 years ago was actually predicted to a T and actually happened on the date they said, which there's no prophecies like that I'm aware of anyway. But
Well, there,
the
but there. Well, I'll give you the best one because this is the one that a lot of us use as a counter apologetic. It's the prophecy of the fall of Tyre. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but um, I'd have to look it up. But it's in my book, and they one of the Old Testament writers might have been Isaiah. I just don't know, but he predicted that Nebuchadnezzar himself would invade and conquer Tyre and would utterly desolate it into an area where there was nothing but rocks where fishermen would come and cast their nets. God was going to utterly destroy Tyre. Well, in fact, because they wrote that prophecy before anything took place historically, we can go and look in the historical record. We can see that Nebuchadnezzar did in fact attack Tyre, but was unable to take the city and retreated. It was an explicit prophecy that explicitly failed. So there are times when we can look at history and we can disprove prophecy.
Sure. Sure. I can easily see how you can disprove it. I just don't see how you can prove it happens.
Yeah,
Like that,
but the religious person's telling me I can't disprove it, and I'm
well,
telling them that as soon as they make a real world claim, it can be disproven.
yeah. Yeah. Well, if you have nothing in the current times that God is doing anything that's testable, you literally can just say, well, I just take it on faith. And I don't know what to tell you if that's the way you're going to live. If you just want to live by faith, have at it. Enjoy your life because there's nothing sensical about that. You're just basically just making shit up as you go and just claiming it's faith, but you don't have any good real reason to believe it, but that's the
Right,
preterist world. And it's like they're not looking for anything future to come. They're living in this full kingdom now. This is it. This is the glory of God. How do you know? I take it on faith because he said so. What?
right.
What is he doing for you? He's giving me the joy of the Lord. Okay, the fruit of the spirit,
Yeah.
the armor of righteousness. Like what the fuck? Like it's all freaking like invisible shit that you're just making up and saying this is what I get in the kingdom. Bro, like all these things you get are all based on faith. Like why are you living like this? It's like, I
I
can't
mean,
believe
you can try. You can try to narrow it down and eliminate as much problems as you possibly can. But eventually you're gonna have to step out and you're gonna say something. And even if it's just a claim about history, like we've got a whole field of secular scholarship on history. I mean, you want to make claims about what happened in Israel's history as a preterist, that's going to fall apart too. I mean, eventually you're going to get disproven on something. I mean, it's just that like every other Christian denomination, they're going to just refuse the proof. But it is there.
it is indeed. There's no question about it. But one thing we have seen throughout our last two shows for sure is you got a whole bunch of different perspectives on Genesis. You got different perspectives on how to read the whole Bible, when it was written, who wrote it. Good grief, dude. That one thing we can see is that every Christian has their own version of Christianity.
For sure.
We're here to unravel your conversion.
Yeah, conversion.
Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you next time.